During World War II, there was a plant so powerful that military commanders were ordered never to name it. Not in reports, not in manuals, not even in letters home. Soldiers across every battlefield were growing something that outproduced tomatoes, survived every season without replanting, and stored for 6 months without spoiling. And they were doing it with nothing but a handful of seeds. By 1945, over 40% of frontline soldiers were cultivating it in secret. But the moment the war ended, orders came down. Destroy every plant. Burn the seeds. Soldiers who tried to bring it home were stopped at borders. Farmers who kept growing it were silenced. Why? Because this plant was a threat to seed companies, to grocery chains, to anyone who profited from your dependence on their system. Today, billion-dollar agriculture corporations don't want you to know it exists. Because if people realized they could grow something better than tomatoes that never needs replanting and feeds families for months, their entire industry would collapse. But the truth can't stay buried forever. In this video, we're uncovering the forbidden plant World War II soldiers risked everything to grow. The plant deliberately erased from history. And most importantly, how you can start growing it today, no matter what they say. By the end, you'll know exactly what it is, why they banned it, and how to grow it yourself when the system stops feeding you. Number 1. The discovery that changed everything. It started in a Polish village in the winter of 1942. A reconnaissance unit, cut off from supply lines and starving, stumbled upon an abandoned farm. The barn was burned. The fields were scorched. But in the corner of a forgotten root cellar, they found something growing in complete darkness. No sunlight, no water for weeks. Just roots, spreading through cracked stone, producing small, bulbous growths that smelled earthy and sharp. The soldiers didn't know what it was. But hunger doesn't ask questions. They cooked it, ate it, and survived another week. Then someone had an idea. What if they could grow this themselves? They took cuttings, planted them in shallow trenches behind their bunker, and within 30 days, they had more food than their rations ever provided. Word spread fast. Not through official channels, but through something far more powerful. Soldier to soldier, trench to trench. A whispered secret that kept men alive when governments couldn't. This wasn't just a vegetable. It was Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke. And unlike tomatoes that died after one season, unlike potatoes that rotted in storage, this plant did something extraordinary. Once planted, it never stopped producing, year after year, without replanting, without fertilizer, without care. And that made it dangerous, because a population that can feed itself doesn't need permission to survive. Number 2, why it outperformed every victory garden crop. Back home, governments were pushing victory gardens. Grow tomatoes, grow carrots, grow beans. Patriotic posters covered every wall. But soldiers on the front lines knew the truth. Those crops were temporary, seasonal, dependent on perfect conditions. Jerusalem artichoke was different. It didn't care about frost. It didn't need rich soil. It thrived in bombed-out wastelands where nothing else would grow. One soldier in a diary entry, later confiscated and sealed, wrote, "Planted it in April, harvested in October, left the roots in the ground. Next spring, twice as many came back. We stopped planting anything else." The numbers were staggering. A single tomato plant might produce 10 to 15 pounds of fruit per season, if you were lucky. Jerusalem artichoke? One plant produced 50 to 75 pounds of edible tubers. And because the roots stayed alive underground, it multiplied every year without any effort. Civilians in occupied territories caught on fast. Families who had their food seized by enemy forces began planting it in hidden plots, under floorboards, in forest clearings, even in bomb craters, because soldiers could take your harvest, but they couldn't take what was still growing underground. By 1944, entire resistance networks were sustained by this plant, not because it was exotic, but because it was unstoppable. Number 3, the 6-month storage secret. Food spoilage killed more civilians during World War II than many people realize. Refrigeration was rare. Canning supplies were rationed. And when winter came, families who hadn't stored food properly starved, even if they'd had a good harvest. But Jerusalem artichoke had a built-in survival mechanism that no one expected. After harvest, the tubers didn't rot. They didn't mold. They didn't need canning, freezing, or any preservation method at all. You could pile them in a cold cellar, cover them with sand or straw, and they'd stay fresh for 6 months, sometimes longer. Soldiers discovered this by accident. A unit in France harvested a batch in October, stored it in a makeshift dugout, and forgot about it. When they returned in March, expecting rot and waste, the tubers were still firm, still edible, still nutritious. This changed everything. Families who grew it had food security that victory gardens could never provide. They weren't dependent on harvest seasons anymore. They could eat in January what they'd dug up in September. No electricity, no fancy equipment, just a cool, dark space and nature's own preservation system. And here's the part that terrified food corporations. If people realized they didn't need refrigerators, canning jars, or grocery store supply chains to store food for half a year, billions of dollars in infrastructure became obsolete overnight. So, after the war, when soldiers tried to teach their families how to grow and store it, agricultural agencies launched a quiet campaign. They called it invasive. They called it a weed. They warned it would take over gardens. Anything to make people afraid of the one crop that made them independent. Number 4. The replanting myth that kept people dependent. Every spring, farmers and gardeners do the same thing. They buy new seeds, they replant, they start over. It's a cycle that's been so normalized, most people don't even question it anymore. But during World War II, soldiers learned something that seed companies desperately wanted to keep hidden. You don't need to replant Jerusalem artichoke. Ever. Here's how it works. When you harvest the tubers in fall, you don't dig up every single one. You leave a few in the ground. Not because you're careless. Because those leftover tubers become next year's crop. They survive freezing winters underground, sprout again in spring, and produce even more food than the year before. One soldier in a recovered journal wrote, "I planted 12 tubers in 1943. By 1945, I had over 200 plants. I never bought seeds. I never replanted. I just left the ground alone and it kept giving." This was revolutionary. And it was a direct threat to an industry built on selling you seeds every single year. Tomatoes don't do this. Carrots don't do this. Almost nothing in a modern garden does this. But Jerusalem artichoke does. Naturally. Effortlessly. Permanently. After the war, seed catalogs stopped listing it. Agricultural colleges stopped teaching it. And when curious farmers asked why, they were told it was too aggressive or not commercially viable. But the real reason was simple. A crop that replants itself doesn't make money for anyone but the person growing it. Today, you can still find it. But you have to look. And that's exactly how they want it. Number 5. The nutritional power governments didn't want publicized. Rationing during World War II wasn't just about scarcity, it was about control. Governments decided who ate, how much, and when. Coupons, stamps, and lines at distribution centers kept populations dependent. But soldiers who grew Jerusalem artichoke discovered something that threatened that entire system. This plant wasn't just filling, it was nutritionally superior to almost every rationed crop. High in iron, potassium, and fiber. Rich in a prebiotic called inulin that supported gut health when medicine was scarce. And most importantly, it provided consistent energy without the blood sugar crashes that came from bread and potatoes. Soldiers who ate it regularly reported better endurance, fewer illnesses, and sharper focus in combat. But here's what made it truly dangerous to the establishment. It grew so abundantly that rationing became irrelevant. A single family plot could produce enough to feed 6 people year-round. No coupons needed, no government approval required, no standing in line. Resistance groups in occupied zones used it to stay independent from enemy food distribution. They didn't have to risk exposure by lining up for rations. They just grew their own. And that autonomy was unacceptable to anyone trying to control a population through scarcity. After the war, nutritional studies on Jerusalem artichoke were quietly shelved. Government food pyramids promoted grains, dairy, and produce that required industrial farming. And this plant, which thrived without any of that infrastructure, was written out of the narrative. Even today, most people have never heard of it, not because it doesn't work, but because it works too well. Number 6. Why modern farmers were told to avoid it. In the decades after World War II, industrial agriculture exploded. Massive farms, chemical fertilizers, pesticides, monoculture crops designed for maximum profit, not maximum nutrition. And in that new system, there was no room for a plant that didn't need any of it. Jerusalem artichoke grows without fertilizer. It resists pests naturally. It doesn't require pesticides, herbicides, or genetic modification. And worst of all, from a corporate perspective, it spreads on its own. You can't patent it. You can't control it. You can't make farmers buy it every year. So, agricultural agencies began a campaign. They labeled it invasive. They warned it would choke out other crops. They published studies showing it was difficult to manage. But here's the truth buried in those reports. It wasn't difficult to manage. It was impossible to profit from. Farmers who tried to grow it commercially in the 1,950 seconds and 60 seconds were pressured to stop. Not by consumers, not by market demand, but by suppliers who refused to do business with anyone growing crops that didn't require their products. Seed companies, fertilizer manufacturers, and chemical corporations built an entire industry on dependence. And Jerusalem artichoke represented independence. Older farmers, especially those who remembered the war, kept growing it in secret. Small plots hidden behind barns, patches in back corners of fields. They knew what it could do. But they also knew that talking about it openly meant risking their relationships with the suppliers they needed for everything else. Today, industrial farming is more entrenched than ever. But cracks are forming, and every time the system fails, whether it's supply chain collapses, droughts, or economic crashes, people start remembering the crops that don't need the system at all. Number 7. The taste deception that kept it hidden. One of the most effective ways to bury a food isn't to ban it. It's to convince people it doesn't taste good. And that's exactly what happened to Jerusalem artichoke after the war. Cookbooks stopped including recipes. Food magazines ignored it. And when it was mentioned at all, it was described as earthy, strange, or an acquired taste. But soldiers who ate it during the war told a different story. When roasted, it tastes like a cross between a potato and a chestnut. Sweet, nutty, and satisfying. When boiled and mashed, it's creamy and rich. When sliced, thin, and fried, it's crispy and addictive. It wasn't unappetizing. It was unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity was easy to weaponize. Civilians returning to normal life after the war wanted comfort. They wanted the foods they remembered from before. Tomatoes, corn, potatoes. Familiar flavors that reminded them of peace. And food companies capitalized on that nostalgia. They flooded the market with processed versions of those familiar crops. Canned tomatoes, instant potatoes, frozen corn, all of it convenient, all of it shelf-stable, and all of it profitable. Jerusalem artichoke didn't fit that model. It was fresh, it was real, and it required people to actually cook, so it was quietly phased out of culinary culture. Recipes disappeared. Grandmothers stopped teaching it, and within a generation, people forgot it had ever been food at all. But here's the irony. The same generation that forgot how to cook Jerusalem artichoke now pays premium prices for exotic vegetables that are far less nutritious and far more expensive. Because marketing convinced them that familiar is safe and unfamiliar is risky. The truth? Sometimes the safest food is the one they convinced you to forget. Number 8. How to grow it today, and why you should start now. Here's the part they really don't want you to know. Growing Jerusalem artichoke today is easier than growing tomatoes. And in a world where food prices are skyrocketing, supply chains are fragile, and dependence on grocery stores feels more dangerous every day, this plant is your insurance policy. All you need is a small patch of ground. Even poor soil works. Plant the tubers in early spring, about 4 to 6 inches deep and a foot apart. Water once. Then forget about it. Seriously. It doesn't need babying. It doesn't need fertilizer. It doesn't need pesticides. It just grows. By late summer, you'll see tall stalks with bright yellow flowers. In fall, those stalks will die back. That's your signal to harvest. Dig up the tubers, leaving a few in the ground for next year. Store the rest in a cool, dark place. And you're done. One harvest will feed you through winter and into spring. And next year, you'll have double the plants without planting a single new tuber. It's the closest thing to free food that exists. But here's the warning they always give. It's invasive. It'll take over your garden. And they're not entirely wrong. It spreads. But that's not a flaw. That's the point. In a survival situation, in a collapse scenario, in any moment when food becomes scarce, you want a crop that refuses to die. You want something that fights to feed you, not something that gives up after one bad season. If you're worried about it spreading, grow it in a contained bed, use barriers, or plant it somewhere away from your main garden. But don't let fear of abundance stop you from planting the one crop that could save you when everything else fails. Because the system thrives on scarcity, and they'll do everything they can to keep you scared of the one plant that creates abundance without their permission. This wasn't just a plant. It was a symbol of independence, of resilience, of people refusing to starve while waiting for someone else to save them. And that's exactly why it had to be erased. Soldiers who grew it weren't just feeding themselves. They were proving that survival doesn't require government approval, corporate supply chains, or permission from anyone. And in a world built on control through dependence, that kind of knowledge is more dangerous than any weapon. Today, we live in a system that wants you to believe food comes from stores, that seeds come from companies, that without their infrastructure, you'd starve. But history tells a different story. During the worst war humanity ever fought, ordinary people fed themselves with a plant that cost nothing, required nothing, and gave everything. And it's still here, waiting, not in grocery stores, not in seed catalogs, but in the forgotten corners of old farms, in the wild spaces along roadsides, and in the memories of those who remember when food was freedom. The choice is yours. You can keep depending on a system that profits from your hunger, or you can plant something that refuses to let you starve. If you believe this knowledge should never have been buried, if you want to be independent instead of dependent, if you understand that the most powerful rebellion is growing your own food without anyone's permission, then you're exactly where you need to be. Subscribe now, learn what they erased, and become the generation that refuses to forget.